Welcome to Mindvalley Book Club interviews. As usual, I'm Kristina co-founder of Mindvalley and host of Mindvalley Book Club. And today we're going to be talking about a very interesting book, really very interesting book, Mindmasters. And my guest today is Sandra Matz. Welcome, Sandra.
Thank you so much for having me. And it's so funny that you mentioned this, like, because I work in the technology space at the intersection of psychology, computer science, and people just assume that I know how to fix computers. So it's like whenever something breaks down, they're like, well, can you fix it? I'm like, no, that's not what I do. So I hear you on the technical difficulties front.
But you are a professor in Columbia University. You're a professor in business, right?
Yeah. So I'm currently in a business school, but was coming from psychology and computer science.
Yes, as I was reading the book, I was wondering what is the stronger side, psychology or computer science?
It's a great question. I think it depends a little bit on what you're thinking about, because the questions mostly come from psychology. So the questions are all about human behavior. How do people make decisions? Can we capture their preferences? To what extent are their choices driven by their personality dispositions as opposed to the situations that they're in? So the questions very much come from psychology, and it's really the methods that we borrow from the computer sciences. So instead of just using the traditional psych toolkit, which is questionnaires and these experiments in the lab, we kind of now look at data and in the context of algorithms and AI.
So you're a high-tech psychologist in a way.
A high-tech psychologist, yes.
So, some other maybe notes about your bio is that this is actually the work of your life at this moment, and this is what you're an expert in and have been actually featured in quite a lot of mainstream media. And as I started, usually I would read out the bio, but we've actually went so smooth into who you are and what you do. But I feel that repeating the facts will be a little bit redundant. But the book that we're talking about is Mindmasters, which is exactly the intersection of technology and psychology. And I guess I know that in your book you do open with your personal story, but I would like to start maybe how did you come to research psychological profiling, which is in essence the core topic of the book. Yeah, it's because technology is far away from the human
Yeah,
side.
no, totally. And it's funny because I think, right, I always feel like I live in these two worlds. One is, I describe it as like the messy world of human behavior, right? It's like feelings, it's preferences, it's motivations. And then the other side is like the far more structured and cold world of math and algorithms and data. And the way that they were actually married in a way or integrated was that I think psychology for the longest time, right? If you think about what is the core of psychology, it's a behavioral science. It's always meant to understand how human behavior unfolds in real life. Now the problem is it was really, really difficult to do. Like if you really want to study the behavior on a daily basis, when people interact with one another, instead of just giving them questionnaires to kind of reflect back on how they think about themselves, or have these very stylized experiments where we invite people to the lab and they have to press a bunch of buttons on the laptop, and then we generalize and say now we don't know something about how the human mind works. To me, and I did psychology in my undergrad, so I was interested in this messy human world, but it felt like it was falling a little bit short of my expectations, because I always felt we're not really understanding behavior in daily life, because it's really, really difficult to do with a traditional toolkit. So much so that there's this one book that at some point got published, I think in the 1940s, of two psychologists that said we want to really study the lived experience of children. So what they did is they picked one boy in rural Kansas. I think his name was Raymond Birch, 7 years old kid. And they were like, let's capture everything that this kid does morning to evening. And they had 8 research assistants. So they had, for this one kid, 24 hours, 8 research assistants looking over his shoulder. The moment he wakes up, they take a note and say, Raymond is up now. And when he has conversations with his mom or like piano lessons. So you have these 8 people looking over the shoulder of one kid. And they call it, like, now we understand the lived experience of children. a bit of a stretch, right? Because it was only one kid, and it's
It's
not
like a
entirely.
Truman Show, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And it's also not clear, like once you understand it is 8 other people looking over your shoulder, capturing everything that you do, you probably don't behave in the most natural way. So very, very limited in terms of studying actual behavior. Now, fast forward to the world where we constantly interact with these digital devices. We kind of leave so many traces that get us at similar constructs, right? You kind of pick up your phone in the morning. I know that you're up now. I know that the phone was stationary and off for the entire night. So you pick it up. I know that this is like when you wake up. There's no need for a research assistant to take a note. I know who you communicate with because you oftentimes do this via chat, via phone, email, and so on. I know your physical activity. I know where you go because, again, your phone or like your tracker kind of captures your GPS. And so for me, this world of there's suddenly a way that we can understand daily behaviors at scale was just fascinating. So I ditched all of my original plans of just studying psychology exclusively and kind of ramped up on my computer science methods toolkit. And it's been fascinating because there's so much that we can learn about both individuals, but also like psychology as a whole.
So I have to say that, you know, as I was reading the book, I I had an impression that you are really on the intersection of a lot of sciences. And also, I mean, your profession is business.
Yeah.
But there is social sciences, there's psychology, there's definitely a lot of technology in this book. So I have to, I'll maybe tell you a little bit, the people who are listening us live or in recording, if you haven't read the book yet, we did share the link, then the book is talking about how we interact with technology, how it is possible to make predictions about our personality based on our interactions with technology and what kind of implications that might bring on us. And what I find very appealing about you, Sandra, is that while you do talk about the dangers very clearly, but you are also very optimistic, as in saying that, you know, it's neither negative nor positive nor neutral, as you quoted in one place, but it gives us opportunities as much as it is maybe a challenge. So I have. The book comes with a warning. It is very engaging and interactive. Yes, I honestly, it's like it's such an interesting book to read. So warmly recommend if you haven't done it yet. Now, maybe we'll start from the start.
It sounds great.
I want to build up a little bit. We won't be able to
Yeah.
talk about the whole book, obviously, because we only talk for about 40 minutes. The book will take quite a bit longer to read. And then if you do also the tests and all the other interesting things, which you are welcome to do while you're reading the book, then it will take you a bit longer. But you start with explaining how social media, for example, the traces that we leave there, how they are, they say so much about our personality. And surprisingly, there is actually professional academic research into that. So it's not just the feeling. So could you maybe run down a little bit, like through everything that's,
Yeah.
yes, that's the danger
No,
there.
absolutely. Yeah. And so for me, what is interesting is that in a way, what we can do online now mirrors in many ways our offline world, right? So the fact that if you think about what you do day to day, there's certain things that you put out there that psychologists would call identity claims. So those are very explicit signals of who you want to be, and both for yourself, but also for the outside world, right? That's the poster that you put up in your office. That's like a bumper sticker on your car. So those are very explicit signals of who you are. And if you think about those signals in the context of technology, social media is a prime example. Social media is like where you kind of put out there, here's the stuff that I'm interested in, here's what I want to talk about, right? That could be like your last vacation, what you do, what you're up to on the weekend. So it's like this breeding ground for these identity claims. And what we know is actually, this is also true in an offline world. There's been this early work showing that if I let someone into my office right now who's never met me and I'm not here, and they just snoop around They just kind of try and see, okay, desk looks a little bit, you can't see this, but desk looks a little bit messy. The bin hasn't been emptied in a while, but there's also like all of the signs on the board. They can actually make pretty good inferences about who I am, right? So maybe not as organized, but somewhat more intellectually curious. And the same is true for algorithms. So the moment that algorithms can snoop around in these digital identity claims, and that's anywhere from you again posting on social media, on some of the other like other platforms, you blogging, you liking something on Facebook, or you kind of following a certain artist somewhere. So those are all these explicit identity claims. And what we know is that algorithms are pretty good at playing the Sherlock Holmes games, right? So they see the data of thousands of people, and then they can start making these empirical relationships and saying like, okay, we see that people who write their status updates in all caps and they talk about weekends and how much fun they're having with their friends, they're probably a bit more extroverted, right? People who talk about themselves sitting at home reading a book, and they're probably somewhat more introverted. Exactly, like so the same here. So you kind of see these people being borne out in the data. And oftentimes what is interesting is that sometimes these traces are very obvious, which is great for psychologists because it gives us confidence that we're actually capturing something meaningful. So again, like the extroverts talking about social activities is not super interesting, but there's like other interesting ones where we know, for example, that if you like skydiving, you're somewhat more emotionally stable because jumping out of an airplane is just not as much fun. If you're extremely neurotic, if you spend a lot of money on pets, you're more agreeable, so you're more caring and trusting. If you swear all the time, you're more critical and competitive. So some of these relationships are somewhat obvious. But then what's interesting for psychologists is that some of them are not. So we oftentimes learn something about how the human mind works just by letting the data speak. And my favorite example, and we might actually go there later on because it's like one of these contexts where I think there's a lot of potential, is the use of first person pronouns. So I,
Yes.
me, myself, references to the self. And I remember still, and you're already smiling because you know where this is going, but I remember sitting at this conference and it was like a room full of psychologists, like people who think about this all the time. And the speaker just posed a question: what do you think the use of these first person pronouns, the references to the self, are related to in terms of our psychology? And everybody at the table was like, it has to be narcissism. If someone talks about themselves all the time, they're probably narcissistic. Turns out it's not the case. What it's actually indicative of is emotional distress. So if you talk a lot about yourself, you're more likely to suffer from anxiety, from depression, from other forms of emotional distress. And not immediately obvious, at least to not people at the table or people in the room. Again, all psychologists doing this on a daily basis. But then if you sit down and you think about it, it actually makes a lot of sense, right? Because when you feel down and you feel depressed, most of the time you focus inward. You don't think about the world's biggest problems and how to solve them. What you think about is, why am I feeling so bad? How do I get better? Am I ever going to get better? And this inner monologue, this inner kind of conversation that we have with ourselves just creeps into the language that we use, so much so that people who suffer from depression, I think, use first person pronouns about 40% more. So that's a lot if you accumulate this across a whole day. So for me, this is like one of these examples where some of the relationships that you see are kind of obvious, and it's nice because it says that, yeah, we're measuring something meaningful, but then we also oftentimes learn something new that we didn't know before.
But that's actually the benefit of algorithms, because sometimes our intuitive guesses are not really empirically proven. Why I was laughing, it was because as I was coming to the office, I was walking through the park. I was actually thinking about this part in your book and trying to focus my thoughts on the future rather than the present moment, which is an interesting thing. So if you guys find this kind of connections interesting, this book, by the way, has a lot of those examples, and you will also be able to guess. I really loved example about intelligence. It crossed my mind for a moment, but then no, it can't be.
Yeah, I think that's what I love about the fact that you marry psychology and computer science, because it makes sense, right? So we all understand the basics of personality of psych, and it kind of makes the data that we generate just a lot more human, and it makes it somewhat more tangible and relatable. That's what I love about this intersection.
So for those of you who are not on social media, first of all, congratulations. Second, we'll get to you, don't worry. You're not safe.
Yeah, yeah,
But
that's true.
I wanted to make a little sidestep from that, and it's not in the book directly, but as I was reading the book and reading all these examples, one thing that I've noticed was the introspection into my own presence online, and wondering. We humans are very often a little bit autopiloted, and we do things without even thinking what it means. But what was interesting for me as I was looking at these examples, I was wondering, oh, maybe there is something here which is interesting for me about me that I haven't noticed. I do that, but I haven't noticed that. So this, I do not know if you've had this feedback before on your book, but it is actually a really good place also to sit down and think, reflect on not just the image that you leave online, but what does that image that you leave, what does it say about you?
About you. And it's, yeah, I agree. I don't think I've had the feedback before, so that's interesting. But I think a lot about, there's oftentimes people say, well, everything that you do on social media is just like self-idealization, right? We all kind of pretend that we live these happy lives, are healthy and excited about everything. Whereas in reality, that might not be the case. For me, it's actually so interesting of that's still part of who you are, right? So the dreaming of your, here's my aspirational self, here's the person that I actually in an ideal world would want to be, still is part of your identity. So even if some of this, and what we know is that most of the time it goes in the same direction. So we all are a little bit less neurotic, we all are a little bit more extroverted on social media, but it's still like something, even your ideal self is still part of your identity. And for me, that's like a fascinating thing to study. Like, what is the gap? So we had like this research with one of my grad students where we just looked at what's the discrepancy between how you present yourself on social media as opposed to like in other places, or like if I ask you questions in a context where you don't have an incentive to make your life look a little bit better. And what we see is like the more you have this discrepancy between who you are in an offline context as opposed to social media, the less you actually benefit from social media. So just essentially life satisfaction goes down, happiness goes down. And it's like it's an interesting starting point to say, okay, how do we actually, if people really want to get there, how do we help them get there? Or if it's just like this fluffy ideal that they're never going to accomplish and it might not even be the best for them, it's maybe just socially driven, how do we allow them to become closer to who they naturally are?
And the very interesting aspect was also that some of the information you're revealing unknowingly, like you were showing the words which are used by people who are more affluent versus those who are poorer, and they had nothing to do with actually, well, the wealth as much as some other revealing words. So it's not always possible to completely hide who you are if you are in the spotlight.
Yeah.
But I want you to also maybe say a few words for those people who are the brave among us and are not present on social media. What I got out of this book was that if you don't want to be visible, you have to live in a forest, probably only use cash, and probably have a neighbor actually deliver the stuff.
Exactly. It's what I always tell people, because usually there's, and again, kudos to those people who don't use social media. I think that you get benefits in other parts of your life, but it doesn't mean that you can't be tracked, right? So you're absolutely right. Unless you live out there in the woods and grow your own vegetables, there's going to be ways in which I can capture data. And this is actually kind of coming back to this notion of psychologists make this distinction between these explicit identity claims and what we call behavioral residue. And behavioral residue are all of the traces that you inadvertently create. So you don't really think about it, you don't intentionally put them out there, but just by merely interacting either with your physical environment, with the digital environment, you create those traces. So in an offline context, that would be, it's not the poster that I put up in my office, but again, the fact that my bin is overflowing or the fact that my desk is disorganized. In an online world, there's all of these traces, including like your Google searches that we don't intentionally necessarily put out there to signal who we are, browsing histories, cookies, your credit card swipes, the fact that you carry your smartphone with you 24/7, right? And that smartphone, you can think of it as like a stalker walking behind you 24/7. Like it knows exactly where you are, what you do, knows who you meet, because that's phones showing up in the same location at the same time. So there's like all of these traces that kind of give us an equally interesting and intimate picture of your psychology, but you don't intentionally create them. And there's like, if you fast forward even more, because you could always argue, well, I'm going to leave my phone at home and I'm not going to use my credit card, like the mafia has figured that out a while ago. But now there's facial recognition. So in Manhattan, you can't go from lower Manhattan to Upper Manhattan is where Columbia campus is based, without being seen by a camera. And if you combine that with facial recognition, that means that there's just no way of escaping the tracking. Because the same way that your phone knows where you are, facial recognition can pick up on of you walking around the city and again, who you're meeting and so on. So it's almost impossible to escape this form of tracking, which makes thinking through the applications or implications even more important, right?
Yeah, so this conversation is definitely very interesting. And if you want more of that, you can get the book and actually dive a little deeper into this, into all, including what is the personality and what are the traits that you can gauge from your presence, technological presence. But I want to maybe touch upon the less pleasant part of it. So it is curious. Of course, it is very interesting. As any science, it's very interesting, but it is also a little dangerous. And I know that you say that a lot of people say, "So what?" to you, and what's the big deal? So what's the big deal? Why isn't it good?
Yeah. Well, it's not universally good. So for me, there's actually there's two big components that I think are dangerous about this. The first one is privacy, right? So the moment that you have an algorithm who can understand whether you're impulsive, neurotic, whether you might be suffering from mental health issues, whether you might be gay, whether you might be like of a certain political affiliation, those are very intimate insights, right? Those are oftentimes insights that we don't necessarily want to openly put out there. And still, just by getting your data, I can make these inferences in a relatively accurate fashion. So the question is, like, why do we care about this privacy? Because I oftentimes have people who say, like, look, I have nothing to hide.
Yeah.
And I don't really care about my privacy as much. And I actually get the sentiment, because I think the sentiment is coming from this feeling of it's already out there. I can't get it back. And it might just kind of give in, so I don't stress about it all the time. But I do think it's a pretty risky gamble, because first of all, it's a privileged view, right? Like when my MBA students say that, well, like it's maybe true for you that you don't worry about your data being out there, but it's not true for everybody else. Like there's still places in the world where being gay is prosecuted. In the US, I think there was this recent example where suddenly abortion was limited in certain states, and a lot of women across the board had to be worried about their Google searches, right? Their GPS records, because I can see that you're going to a certain clinic. I can maybe see that you're traveling across states, and your Google searches for like baby stuff and pregnancy suddenly stop. So kind of suddenly this idea that you're privileged in the here and now, and you maybe really feel like you don't have to worry, but that might not be true in the future, because you don't know what leadership is going to look like tomorrow. And there's this thing in the book that it's essentially this idea that data is permanent, but leadership isn't. And sometimes that's the leadership of countries, sometimes that's the leadership of companies, right? Like I might trust Apple today that they're using my data to benefit me and make my product great. What if tomorrow they have a different CEO with completely different values? So it's like this idea that we're protected could be true in the here and now, but it might not be true in the future. So that's why I think we kind of, on the base level, we should care about privacy. The second one, which I think is, especially in the US, people seem to care a lot more about, is this idea of self-determination, right? So privacy is one thing, but the moment that I understand your preferences and your motivations and your kind of buttons, if you want, like I can actually not just peek into your psychology, I can also change it. So the same way that in an offline context, let's say kids are remarkably good at figuring out, how do I talk to mom if I want to get candy, as opposed to how do I talk to dad if I want candy, right? So every car salesperson goes through the process of, I try to understand who you are, and the better I know, the easier it is for me to shift your behavior. And that's true for like the context of psychological targeting in the digital world too. If I know who you are and what motivates you, your fears and preferences and desires, I can push your behavior in certain directions. Could be as simple as selling you some toothpaste, could be as kind of fundamental as getting you to vote for a certain candidate, pick a certain job, and so on. So for me, this idea that if we're giving up privacy, we're really giving up our ability to kind of take control of our own lives, right? The decisions that we make are suddenly no longer our own because someone can poke around and change how we think about the world, how we feel about the world, and eventually how we behave.
Yeah, I guess the fact that some countries take decisions and then go back on these decisions a few years later maybe is the sign of people being pushed into a decision. But you know what? As I'm thinking about that, in the past I used to do marketing quite a bit. I think I still have a little bit of that in me. And in marketing world, it's almost a rather ability to manipulate other people's feelings and emotions so that we actually while if something like that is applied to me personally, I feel disturbed. But if I'm looking for a marketer, we are in awe of the people who are capable of selling anything to anyone, and that doesn't seem to be. I somehow haven't come across in our contemporary discourse this sentiment that this is a little bit creepy.
Yeah.
We allow this to happen.
I 100% agree. And for me, the interesting part is that like data's always been part of marketing, right? Whether that's consumer products or the political space. Obama in the US was celebrated in 2008 for his clever use of data. I think what makes this different in a way is that it's so much more relatable, right? If I can tell you, I'm not just only using your data says if you're neurotic or impulsive, that also means that it's a lot easier for me to potentially play into the vulnerable sides of who you are, your personality dispositions. And so for me, the marketing space is actually, it's the perfect example for how it can totally go both ways, right? Because you can actually make products more relevant for people in a way that they benefit more. Like if we assume that we all have to kind of buy a phone and we all have to buy beauty products and we all have to spend money on some things, the more I can make it psychologically meaningful for you, the more you actually benefit. So I kind of, this goes back to some of the early work that I did when I was still in grad school, is the more that people manage to align their spending with their personality, the happier they actually are, right? Because oftentimes, back to what you said earlier, we're so mindless in how we spend our money. So if we just kind of sat down for a second to think about, well, what is it that I actually want to accomplish with my life? Is it to spend more time with my friends? Yeah, then maybe I should be spending my money on kind of experiences that are social. If I kind of am more introverted and I prefer time by myself, yeah, maybe you should be spending money on like making your home better, right? And buying like books. So in some way, I think marketing can actually help. Both kind of helping you find the stuff that you're interested in, but then also kind of making it more meaningful. But you're absolutely right. It kind of very quickly gets this kind of touch and association of just being manipulative, right? It's like you didn't want that extra Gucci bag because you don't even have the money to buy it, but I still kind of got you to get so emotionally attached to it that you overwrote your initial intention of not spending any extra money. And I think there's this, it all comes down to this, what you mentioned earlier, is like technology is neither good nor bad, but it's also not neutral. And that's just kind of is leadership, right? So there has some point is a marketer who decides what they're going to do. And most of the time, I do think they have a pretty good sense of whether what they're doing is helping people or is actually exploiting people. And this is like, it's a thought exercise that I encourage all of the people who come through our executive programs, for example, to do, is think about it from the other side, right? Think about, yeah, maybe you're going to benefit from it here and now as a marketer, but if this was used to target your daughter or someone that you really love, would you still feel comfortable? And if it feels icky, well, maybe you should be kind of taking the moral high ground and kind of reconsider if you can do it slightly differently. Or Warren Buffett has what he calls the front page newspaper test, is imagine if you, like your practices were exposed on tomorrow's front page of the local newspaper. So the newspaper that gets read by everybody you care about. And if what you do was exposed on that front page, would you feel ashamed? And if you would feel ashamed, again, then it's probably not the right thing to do. And then you should go back to the drawing board and see if you can do better.
Mm. But that also means that we are increasingly at the mercy of people who make decisions. And sometimes, as you say, leadership changes. Data is permanent, leadership changes. And that's not just for countries. I was born in a country which doesn't exist anymore. In my case, the leadership changed for the better. But we see a lot of examples where the leadership changes for the worst. Democracies fail, dictators come into power. So, and when we talk about companies, it's even crazier. I used to buy a mobile phone. Now my mobile phone is a Snoop. I don't know when that happened. Nobody asked me if I like to be
It's
listened to.
insane, right? This kind of snoops around everything. There's like this example in the book that I came across, which I thought was fascinating and terrifying, of a woman whose naked picture, when she was like sitting on a toilet, got leaked online, and she could not for the world figure out how it got there, right? She didn't know who took it. She didn't know who kind of put it on the internet. And it turned out that it was her vacuum cleaner. So like her, like those automatic Roomba vacuum cleaners, they need computer vision, right? So they have a camera to navigate your apartment. And she was part of this trial where they were trying to improve like the computer vision of the robot. So they took pictures left and right, and they had contractors somewhere, I think in Central America, and some of them leaked it on the internet. So the moment that we invite all of these devices into our homes, just the chances that something's going to happen with the data just goes up. So I 100% agree. And I do think that there are actually like interesting ways of getting around that not that many people are talking about yet. Because right now, it always feels like there's a trade-off between service and convenience, right? So you can use Google Maps to get from A to B. You can have Alexa in your home to kind of easily ask what the weather is going to be like, how cold it is, to turn on the light and off and on. And so that's like, you can either get that or you can protect your privacy. And the brain is always going to go for the personalization, service, and convenience, right? It's much easier for the brain to say, here's something tangible that I get in the here and now. Those privacy concerns, like, I don't really understand them. Oftentimes they're in the future, so I'm going to discount them. And I think what we really need, and this is kind of coming back to what you just said, I don't want to just trust leaders that they're going to do the right thing. What I want is to eliminate this trade-off. What I want is to have a world, and we can do this now with technology, where I get the service and convenience, but I don't have to give away my data. So the way that this works, and I just want everybody to hear about it, because I think we just have to push for it from a consumer point of view, is that there's something that's called federated learning, which means that if you say, let's take YouTube. So YouTube has a recommendation algorithm, right? They take a look at what you've done in the past, and then they kind of build a model that says, if you've watched these videos, here's the next best video. For that, typically what happens is that everything that you do and watch gets sent to YouTube. They train their model in a central place, and then you benefit from the recommendations. But there's now technology that actually eliminates this step. So instead of you sending your data to YouTube, what YouTube can do is they can send a model to your phone, because your phone is a supercomputer, right? Your phone is, I think, like 1,000 times, 100,000 times more powerful than the computers that we use to launch rockets to space with. So extremely powerful. And YouTube can just send their intelligence to your phone where your data lives. So it automatically updates, it learns something about your preferences, it gets better making recommendations for you. And what it can still send back to YouTube so that we all benefit is, again, the intelligence. So it doesn't send the data, but it kind of tells YouTube, hey, why don't you tweak your model a little bit here and there? Maybe kind of, if you watch this video, you're also going to like this one. So now you get the same recommendations, right? You don't have to use the YouTube, which I have on my phone and is completely useless, which just doesn't have any memory of what you want. What you get is like a personalized recommendation model, but YouTube never gets to hold the original data, right? So the data still is with you. And to me, that's like a total game changer, because you can get many of the benefits without the risks that come from people collecting your data and then maybe abusing it in the future.
But that still is up to the platforms to implement, because and up to your choices. And we are very often, you know how when you're trying to find something, there are all these windows which you just quickly close without even reading what they're about.
Like cookies.
Time is so precious.
Totally. Yeah.
I'm just checking the time, because as I said, I don't have any other way to look at my.
There is, no, you're absolutely right. And I think, so First of all, it already is implemented. So if you have an iPhone, like Apple, for example, trains Siri this way. So they don't kind of collect all of your speech data. They typically do it locally. And I do think that there's actually good business cases to be made for this. Because right now, I think that the general idea is the more data you have, the better. And that's been like around for a while. It's like the Silicon Valley wisdom. But I don't think that's true. Unless you're in a business where you're selling data, which I hope you're not. But unless you're in a business, you're much better off being able to provide the same service and convenience for your user without sitting on this pile of gold. Because the moment that you sit on this pile of gold, you now have to protect it, right? So oftentimes user data is valuable. So if you look at the number of data breaches and security hacks over the last kind of decade has gone up dramatically, which also means that the cost of, like, if you have your data breached, first of all, that goes up. And also, like, all of the effort that companies have to put in to make sure that the data is secure, it's just incredibly expensive, and it's a huge risk for reputation. So if I have the choice between, I can give you exactly what I did before, maybe even better, but I don't sit on this pile of gold and have to protect it, or now I would much rather choose that world. And I can even make it, and Apple does that constantly now. They make it part of the value proposition to their users, right? If you walk through Manhattan, all of the ads that you see for Apple are, we protect your privacy. So you can, in a competitive way, distinguish yourself from other players in the field by saying, look, I kind of reduce my risk, but I also offer you something that you don't get anywhere else. And I do it in a way that doesn't cost you anything in terms of personalization and convenience. And I think that there's like, it's a slow transition, right? It also takes a while to set this up from a technology point of view, but I think there's just so much promise.
So if we take a little step back from that solution, which is a highly technological solution, I want to touch about something which you actually didn't mention in the book, but I think it is interesting since you do have background in psychology. So you said that what compelled you to actually join Mindvalley Book Club is because I wanted to make reading sexy again. Now, you brought an example of GPS, that it's so much easier to travel from spot to spot using GPS. It's not a rocket science if I just say that since we started using GPS, our ability to navigate the streets of any random city has dropped. We don't remember, I used to remember 20 phone numbers, now I don't remember, like, I barely remember two. So is there any research on how technology is impacting our cognitive abilities? Because why do I want to make reading sexy again? Of course, AI can give you the gist of any book. And maybe even this kind of interviews will give you a gist of the book, but there is benefit in actually cognitively engaging with your life.
Yeah. And I think you're totally right? It's like it's the classic use it or lose it example. So anything that you outsource to technology is going to deteriorate, because that's how the brain works, right? So the brain kind of needs to have like these constant connections to stay active. You're just going to lose the kind of, think of it as like a highway. If the highway doesn't get frequented, it just at some point collapses. And I think with technology, there's many ways in which we might get poorer when it comes to our cognitive abilities, right? So one of the examples that I really like, it's not in the book, and it's also not my own research. It's research by Diana Tamir at Princeton. What she looked at is, to what extent do people remember important moments in their life when they take pictures or not? So, like, you go on a vacation, and back in the day, you just used to stare at the cathedral, which was like just incredible, and you were full of awe. You kind of go to Grand Canyon, and it's just like this amazing, magical experience. Now, what they showed, and right now, this is like what we do is we snap a picture, right, and we get 100 pictures, and then we move on. And what they showed is that the moment that you take a picture, you're actually less likely to remember the experience, because your brain is essentially saying like, okay, don't worry about it. We got a copy here. We can always come back to it. So there's like, you can let it go. There's other stuff that you might want to prioritize in this moment. And for me, it's such a sad truth, right? Because of course you could go back to this picture, but how often do you realistically do that, right? Maybe you kind of have a photo bug, but this idea that it's like, it's in your memory, and memories are also, they're so much richer than pictures, right? So memories come with both the kind of, here's how I felt, here's like who else was surrounding me, here's maybe what happened before and after. So the way that even memories get encoded in the brain is like so much richer. You have like all of these different access points. And so we know that this is kind of going down. And I think the same is true for decision making. Not just that we're losing the ability, I'm also worried kind of more and more that we're just going to become more and more boring. So I've been thinking a lot about, and this is actually now post book publishing, is like there's all of these agentic AIs now. So essentially artificial agents who not only kind of tell you something about how the world works, right? They not only summarize the book, they also tell you which book to read next. So they make decisions on your behalf. And I think there's like the risk that we're, first of all, becoming somewhat more similar to one another, because what a large language model does, for example, is like it predicts the one thing that most people will like, right? If you ask it, what should I paint my wall in the color, it's probably going to say something like beige. It's not going to say turquoise and pink in stripes, because most people will hate turquoise and pink in stripes. So we're all going to become a little bit more similar in the choices that we make. And even if you say, hey, I'm going to build a model that's a digital twin of Kristina, so I'm going to give it all of your data, all of your choices, and it now kind of replicates you, it's still going to go with your most likely preference. Right? It's still going to say, what is the most likely book that Kristina will read? So you might not get closer to the average population, but it's going to squish you a little bit in your preferences. So you're not going to go to the fringes anymore. It's like, okay, maybe this book isn't really for me, but I'm happy to try it. So I think there's also this risk that the more we outsource our decision making, we just become so boring. So forget about privacy and self-determination. I don't want to be just like this unidimensional person who kind of gets narrow and narrow in what I kind of see about the world and learn about the world.
Yeah, wow. We just touched upon a very, very interesting topic. Unfortunately, as far as I know, we don't have time for that. But I want to, in a way, symbolically, we came full circle back to where we started, because you said, we take pictures now rather than stare at the cathedral. So obviously we miss certain parts, but we take pictures so that we can present our persona in a certain way on social media. Often. At least in my case, very often I force myself to take pictures because I know I will have to use them. And this is another topic we could have touched upon. It would have been so interesting, if you're forced to be in the public eyes.
Yeah.
But no, guys, you have to read the book. We did just the tip of the iceberg, of course. You can go much deeper into these very interesting, very exciting topics. It's very engagingly written, so you will enjoy the process as well. And if you play along, you will actually learn a lot of interesting stuff about yourself probably as well. So yeah, Mindmasters, the book of the week by Mindvalley Book Club. It's a big deal. And well, at least I hope so. So,
very nice.
So what I wanted to finish with is actually the traditional question. And I know I have two traditional questions now.
Okay.
You have touched upon a few of them. Oh, one thing also skipped from this interview, and what is a conversation in this book, how this psychological profiling can be also a blessing. And in a way, I'm glad we didn't touch upon it because it's another huge topic. So get the book and you'll get to read that. Now, the question I want to ask, if you were to give 1 to 3, either 1, 2, or 3, any number of tips for people who haven't read the book and maybe don't have the time to read the book, what could they do right now to actually make this a safer place for themselves?
Great question. So I could go on a long tangent. I'm going to keep it short. So the one thing that I probably have changed in my own life is I'm much more mindful of my phone. Because I think that's why most people make mistakes. We don't use social media, but then we download a weather app, and that weather app wants to tap into our gallery, into a microphone, into all of our documents. It doesn't need that, right? So like the one thing, and the phone, it's especially if you have an Android phone, the moment that you download an app and you give these permissions, you might not use the app for the next 2 years, but it can happily track you 24/7. So that's like one thing that doesn't actually take that much time, and we don't download apps all the time as we kind of go to websites. So I would recommend being a little bit more mindful with those permissions.
Thank you for that. And my most traditional question is, and I know you've touched upon that answer already, how would you like your book to change the world?
Oh, how would I like to? Yeah, I mean, I really think that there's like so much potential of the data that's out there, right? So you talked about the blessings. I mostly think about like the mental health space. That's just like such a terrible space. So my hope is that instead of having this very tilted playing field where like a few big players benefit from all of the data that we generate, but we barely ever get to see anything. So I'm hoping that we just kind of shift more power to the people who actually generate the data and who could totally benefit in many different ways.
Mm.
And for
So
that, we need people to understand it. So that's what the book is about. It's like, I want you to
yeah,
understand that it's intimate and has power, but you need to ask policymakers, business leaders in your communities to set it up in a way that benefits you.
thank you so much, Sandra, for joining us. I'll show you the book once
Thank
again.
you. Thank you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed reading it, so I recommend you guys also give it a try. As usual, those who are watching online, do leave a heart for my guests in the chat, and if you're watching it in recording, leave a heart under the video in the comments. Love matters, data, you know, is forever, and that heart is also data.
It's true.
So, thank you,
Right.
Sandra, once again for joining us, for writing this book, and also for the wonderful video that you shared with our community before the interview. And I wish huge luck to your book. I think it's a very, very important conversation in contemporary world and society, and we don't have enough of it. So thank you for this.
Thank you so much for making it the book of the week and for having me. I very much enjoyed the conversation. Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.